Hello, folks. Welcome to CG seminar number 167 and about the 45th on the Zoom format. And we've got a very interesting discussion for you today about refugees. Now, but prior to COVID-19, I think refugees and higher education was an issue that many of us thought was just about the most important unsolved problem in the higher education world. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, those issues will still be with us, and they'll be with us in increasing importance over the coming years as more and more populations are forced into mobility, whether they want it or not. And higher education, which now educates almost 40% of all young people, has got a crucial role in relation to refugee and populations. We've got a book symposium to discuss as the medium whereby we'll discuss those issues today, and a great lineup of speakers. I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Hans de Wit, who will then carry the panel through. Let me first take you through the webinar protocols. Remember that the webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be on YouTube in the next 48 hours or so. We also post the chat from the webinar, and do use the chat to talk to each other, to talk to the speakers, and to, of course, raise your questions. We advise you to use speaker view in the Zoom settings as the best way to take in the webinar, so you can see who's speaking. Please keep yourself muted unless you're asked to speak, and we suggest that you turn off your video, but turn it on again when you're asking a question. The process we use for Q&A is, as our regular participants will know, the chat. Post your questions in the chat, and I advise you to come in relatively early in the webinar, like about 2/3 of the way through the speeches, which take the first 30 minutes or so, because questions that come in the last 5-10 minutes often miss out. So put your questions in the chat, and if you want to nominate a particular speaker that you would like to answer your question, do so. When it comes to your question being called in, and I'll give you a warning in the chat if you're going to be called in, we then suggest that you unmute yourself, most important, turn your speaker, turn your video on, and then pose your question directly to the speakers. At this point, it's my delight to hand over to the webinar proper. Let me introduce Hans de Wit. Hans de Wit is Director of the Centre for International Higher Education, CIHE, as initials we know well, at Boston College. He previously served as Director of the Centre for Higher Education Internationalization at Università Cattolica Sacro Cuore in Milan, in Italy, and he was Professor of Internationalization of Higher Education at the Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences. Hans's full biography is in the CG website, which advertised this session, but let me just simply say he's one of the most important leaders, thought leaders in international education in the world, someone whose words in the last 2 decades or so have had an immense influence in shaping the way we see internationalization. So we're very pleased to have him with us today. Hans, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon, and hello everybody from Amsterdam, the Netherlands, although I'm working in Boston College, but the pandemic puts us stranded in all kinds of interesting places. Yeah, thank you for organizing this book symposium about refugees and higher education, transnational perspectives on access, equity and internationalization, a book that was published the end of last year and has been edited by Lisa Unangst, who is with us today as one of the presenters, Hakan again from Turkey, Aras Kajan from Syria, and Tessel Laquil from the United States, and myself. Basically, what happened with refugees in higher education, that when the big increase of refugees from Syria on the one hand, and the ongoing tension in the United States for immigration from the Central America was happening between 5 and 7 years ago, there was this whole kind of polemic happening in the world. But on the one hand, the optimist voice of Angela Merkel said, we schaffen das. And on the other hand, Trump in his election campaign saying we have to build a wall to stop them. And somewhere in between, the world was trying to find a way, how can we deal with this massive increase of refugees coming from, at that time in particular, from Syria, from North Africa, and from Central America, but ignoring that already there was a lot of refugees around the world that had not gotten that attention. We still had this perception that refugees was something that the developed world had to deal with and was trying to stop from, where in the reality, most of the refugees are not in the developed world, but are in the regions where they come from and stay in the neighboring countries. So when, in particular, the Syrian crisis happened, we saw that there was basically a different type of refugees that got much more attention, which were much more educated. They had primary and secondary education, in many cases also higher education, but still they were struggling how to find access to higher education or to even skilled labor in the countries where they came to. And higher education did not respond to that. And Philip Albach, the founding director of the center, and I wrote in 2015 an article in University World News saying, well, why is this? Why is higher education not responding to the refugee crisis and looking in the ways how we can accommodate all those refugees that come to us and help them? And luckily enough, after that, many organizations around the world, the European University Association, for instance, International Association of Universities, and others have been addressing the issues, how to deal with that. And also, we then found out that it's important to not only address the Syrian crisis, but also how to deal with refugee crisis the rest of the world. So that came to the result that we wrote this book together, where we put into information about how higher education deals with refugees, not only in the European context and in the North American context, but also how to deal with it in the African context. And we have Wondwosen Tamrat, from associate professor and founding president of St. Mary College in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, with us talking about that topic, about Australia and how they deal with refugees. And Harvey from the Trobe University is presenting on that, but also how to deal in Latin America with the very big refugee crisis of Venezuelan refugees, and in Myanmar, in refugees in Bangladesh, etc. So it is really a worldwide issue, and we should not focus only exclusively on how we deal with that in the developed world, but in particular how we can help increasing much more, basically saving a whole generation of young people in the world from having the possibility to have much more education, in particular higher education. So that resulted in a book where we had people from connected with Boston College as visiting professors, as research fellows, as graduate students, to work together on this comprehensive research on refugees and higher education. And in particular, Lisa Unangst, who will be the second presenter after me, was leading that project. She did her PhD on refugees and higher education and migrants and higher education in Germany, and is a really expert on that topic. So we have together three panelists that will address this issue from their different continental and professional background. And for sure, we will have very good, interesting discussions. So the first one is who is going to present for us is Andrew Harvey, who is director of the Center for Higher Education, Equity and Diversity Research and associate professor at La Trobe University in Australia. You can find his BC as well, his CV as well elsewhere. So I'm not going to read it just to have enough time, which is always more important in webinars for discussion. So Andrew, first, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hans, and I hope my internet holds up. Greetings from Australia. It's just after 1 a.m. We have 0 COVID cases. Strange times. Thank you, Hans. Thank you also, Simon, for putting the event on. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the chapter in the book, which I also wrote with Professor Betty Lesk, so I acknowledge her, and also drawing on some of our research, which is all available at cheetah.com if you want to have a look at it. So the Centre for Higher Education, Equity and Diversity Research at La Trobe University. I'm just quickly going to outline the Australian policy context today and talk about three groups. One is people from non-English speaking backgrounds. Two is people from refugee backgrounds. And three is people seeking asylum who are technically international students in
Andrew seems to be frozen.
It does happen.
Yeah.
We'll see, give him a minute or two, or a second or two, and see if he comes back.
Andrew,
I'll try.
yeah.
Can you hear me again?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah. So people from non-English speaking backgrounds form one of the 6 equity groups in Australia, but unlike in the UK, that group is not disaggregated at all by ethnicity. ESB students have reasonably good access and participation levels, and some people have called for the group to be abolished as an equity group because NESB students do have very good access levels. However, they don't have good outcomes relative to other students. So one of the issues in Australia with student equity now is the focus on access compared to the focus on other stages of the student life cycle, in particular graduate outcomes. Within that category of non-English speaking background is a subgroup, which is people from refugee backgrounds. Don't know that much about this group specifically, but we can use as a proxy students on humanitarian visas. So we know that some students from refugee backgrounds are underrepresented in higher education, and which is a problem, of course. But we also know that outcomes are particularly poor relatively for those students from a refugee background. And in our own research, we've looked at Somali Australians as a subgroup. There are 16,000 Somali Australians living in Australia at the moment. They have better access and participation rates than other students. Can you still hear me? I'm sorry, this internet is quite unstable.
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, so they have better access. Their unemployment rates, so the unemployment rate for a Somali Australian with a
But not anymore.
At 10. So these are shocking disparities amongst some groups. We know, of course, largely those outcomes are so poor of works, but more importantly, discrimination.
Andrew, the connection is very bad. We cannot hear you well.
I think we'll have to move on, Hans.
Yeah, I think so. Well, otherwise time. So maybe if the connection would be better at the end, we might see if possible, but I would suggest that we go to the second presenter, Lisa Unangst, who is a doctoral graduate from the Center for International Higher Education, but now also as a postdoc at the University of Ghent with the center headed by Jeroen Huisman. So, and she has been doing quite some research on refugees and higher education. And Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hans, and thank you again very much to Simon and his colleagues for the invitation and for taking care of all of the logistics for us. So I'm going to be speaking about the grouping of 3 chapters in our book that focused on Europe. And I'm going to be speaking very briefly about a bit of background on the European context, which I think many of you will likely be familiar with, and then turning to a few selected themes and research questions emerging from those 3 chapters presented in our book. So reflecting on the work of our contributors. I think many folks are aware that, of course, the distribution of refugees and asylum seekers across Europe remains quite uneven. This is information from Eurostat about 2018 and 2019. So we understand that different national contexts and, of course, the higher education systems in those contexts are differently affected by an influx of refugees and asylees. Additionally, there's been quite a gap between the rhetoric used by political leaders, perhaps not as much higher education leaders, although we could make that argument to a lesser degree regarding this influx. So again, quite a differentiated picture across the different national landscapes. And indeed, within any given national context, and I use Germany here as an example, we see uneven distribution of refugees and asylees across across state borders in any given national context. So this is a demonstration of the concentration of refugees in the German case. And in general, we see much higher settlement patterns in states of the former West than we do of the former East. This echoes the patterns of settlement amongst individuals who identify a migration background, much higher rates of migrants settling in the former West. This means, for our purposes, as we think about higher education, that universities, of course, will be, again, unevenly impacted, given that in the German case, and we've seen this in other national cases, students tend to attend university close to home, right, within their given state or province. So turning now to those 3 contributions on the European case, I'll be referencing the work of Natalie BORG, who wrote about Germany and other innovations across Europe, the work of Mike CRONIN and his co-authors at Maynooth University, who focused on the legal status of refugees and their access to higher education in Ireland. And then a piece by a BC alum who's also a Fulbright scholar who did her project on vocational training and paths to higher education in Germany and Sweden. So moving to one theme from each of these chapters for us to think about as we consider our work as scholars and practitioners in refugee higher education. Natalie points in her piece to a number of innovations, points particularly to the work of the European Student Union, which since 2016 has operated a small grants program open to groups of students across the continent. And these grants are meant to support not only direct service to refugees, right? So things like targeted language training, that sort of thing, legal advice, but also what we might consider advocacy projects more broadly. And I offer 2 examples here of this sort of innovation. The Czech Republic hosting this funded online encyclopedia of migration, which is a much smaller scaled down version, if you will, of Wikipedia focused on migration and key statistics that tries to counter a lack of information and how that perhaps intersects with nationalist dialogue, populist dialogue in that context. And then a case that's much more about direct service in Denmark, right? Students supporting an application cafe for refugee background students and a buddies program. I point to this because I think it's critical for us to consider in a cross-national sense, how do we see the work of student groups, student unions, and student government, in some cases guiding supports for refugee background students, in other cases responding quite directly to the stated needs of their peers, of refugee students who are already enrolled. So in a sense, we see here a more grassroots effort to support refugee higher education than perhaps what we might think of as a more top-down effort to establish particular policies, programs, and resource streams from national, state governments, as well as institutional leadership. So what is the role of student groups in supporting refugee higher education cross-nationally? Then we might think about, coming from LUANGRATH's piece, we might think about who tends to be advantaged by existing refugee support programs. And this is a theme that has been picked up by other scholars and practitioners in the field. I think I saw that Michael Grüttner is on the call today, and certainly he and his colleagues have written about this in the German case. So essentially the argument here is that existing programs and policies for refugee higher education and labor market entry tend to advantage particular groups of refugee students, right? Those who tend to be of what we might call traditional college-going age, which of course varies by country, but generally means that they're young, somewhere in the 18 to 25 range, that they are tech literate, that they are proficient either in English or the language of the given country, and have probably already completed some level of higher education, right, either in their home country or in the transition country. This poses some questions for us as we think about equity, right, and how programs and policies are designed centering student equity. And it also poses some questions around what do we mean by success? Is a national policy for refugee higher education or an institutional policy for refugee higher education successful because a participant gains employment or attains a degree? Is it successful if the number of entrants is higher? What do we mean by success? I think we're called clearly here to be less opaque and much more distinct at all levels by what we mean by success in refugee higher education. And then thinking about the intersections of different types of displacement. This is a theme brought up by CRONIN and his co-authors in their piece on Ireland. I offer a quote here from that excellent chapter. So essentially, the argument here is that they found, or they reference a finding that principals in primary and secondary schools across Ireland that saw a higher concentration of students from a migrant background tended to be seeing higher rates of students from refugee or asylee background, but they were also more attentive to some of the equity issues. I'm so sorry about this landscaping noise. This is unintended. Didn't know this was happening today. So they tended to be more aware of these questions around what their students of refugee and asylee backgrounds needed if the school already had a concentration of migrant background students. And a number of those particular concerns are enumerated here: the suitability of the curriculum, access to language services, family engagement, etc. So how do we think about, of course, considering legal status, migrant, refugee, asylee status, as we consider student supports, but also consider that indeed those legal statuses are in many ways arbitrary, right, may depend on a given person's access to legal representation, and in other cases they would have received a different status. And in some, how do we center student needs rather than legal status, right? So just briefly to wrap up, I think two additional, looking at the book as a whole and these three European chapters, two additional themes for research moving forward. Yeah, the need for cross-disciplinary and cross-sector work. This has been echoed by other authors in the field. So the work of higher education institutions, of course, spans not just the education sector, but also, for example, government support agencies, the nonprofit sector, religious sectors, and involves many different stakeholders and actors in order to provide the sort of wraparound or cohesive suite of services that any given student will need to succeed. And further, how do we think about data on who these refugee students are, right? So in that first slide that I showed, that bar graph, again, we're thinking about, uneven distribution of refugee background students across the European context and of course elsewhere. But actually we don't have good data on where they're attending university, how many are hoping to attend university. And that lack of data, I think, clearly indicates that there's difficulty in program development and iteration that centers student needs and centers different hybrid student identities. This also seems to indicate that perhaps increased access to data would shift refugee support programs away from one-size-fits-all programming towards different sorts of scaffolding and offerings for different refugee populations: women, students interested in STEM, students with children, students perhaps who are interested in fields like law and medicine that have really quite slim access rates at different prestigious universities, right? So I'll finish there. Thank you so much. Look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, for this presentation, looking from the European background. I understand that Andrew is back by phone and that connection should be better, so we will give him a chance to come back to finish his presentation. Andrew?
Thanks, Hans. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
We'll try again. The digital divide in Australia is a real thing. Just to make one quick point about Somali Australians here as a particular refugee background group. We talk a lot about access to higher education, but for many groups in Australia, access is not the primary problem. And for Somali Australians, for instance, which number about 16,000 in Australia currently, their access and participation to higher education is higher than other Australians. But their graduate outcomes are relatively poor. A Somali Australian with a bachelor degree has the same unemployment rate as somebody who leaves year 10, another Australian who leaves school at year 10. So the unemployment rates are 3 times higher for graduates, for Somali Australian graduates than other graduates. And what this highlights is the importance of student equity across the life cycle, and that access is critical, but so is the success and the graduate outcomes of students who make it in to higher education. What's also interesting about that is that universities are now responsible for graduate outcomes. Performance-based funding in Australia has been introduced, just as in many US states, which means that the government now directly funds universities for the outcomes of their students, and that university accountability therefore extends beyond graduation into the workforce. So the excuses that universities may have previously used around not being their responsibility to deal with employer discrimination, bias, racism, those excuses are no longer valid if they ever were, but they're also directly influencing university funding. So there's a risk, as with all performance-based funding, that universities stop enrolling students who have poor graduate outcomes. But equally important, there's a responsibility on universities now to accept that challenge and to work with employers and with other organisations to deal with those systemic problems which are stopping refugees background students not only accessing education, but being able to benefit from higher education in the way that other students can. So I just wanted to make that point about the life cycle and the fact that this is an issue that affects not just access, but actually outcomes. The other primary issue in Australia is that students seeking asylum, people seeking asylum who are on temporary protection visas or safe haven entry visas, are treated as international students and required to pay full fees, full international fees, which can be $30,000 a year. So that policy, the policy incoherence remains problematic in Australia as well. Not only are we making higher education virtually impossible for those students, but we're also making it much less fulfilling for other students who can access higher education. So I'll stop there, and as I say, apologies for the earlier connection, but hopefully that's given a different angle about Australia and that life cycle issue, which I think is critical to not just students from refugee backgrounds, by the way, but a whole range of students who have poorer outcomes.
Thank you, Andrew. I think it's very good that you address that issue of the life cycle, because much of the discussion always goes about access to higher education of refugees and immigrants. But we know indeed that those who have access to higher education still have a very big struggle to go through the education, to get internships, for instance. There's a big debate in the Netherlands currently about students from immigrant and refugee background not having internships. And also employability is a big issue, so it's important to address that. Thank you for that. We go to our last presenter, but certainly not least, Wondwosen Tamrat, as I said, associate professor and founding president of St. Mary's University in Ethiopia, and also an expert on private higher education, and a very frequent contributor to publications like University World News on developments in his country and in Africa. And he will talk about refugees in Ethiopia, although unfortunately now these days we also see a lot of Ethiopian refugees struggling with problems in Ethiopia itself. But Wondwosen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hans, for a very generous introduction, and thank you, CGHE, Simon, for the invitation. I think my presentation would bring two different perspectives on this issue of refugee higher education. One is different from the earlier presentations. This will be about countries of first asylum as contrasted with countries of settlement. Secondly, though I will also be dealing with what's happening at the level of policy and at the level of institutions, my focus would bring in an additional input to the discussion on refugee higher education in terms of discussing what refugees themselves do to get the kind of education that they need. So that's how this research was designed with another colleague of mine, self-financing as a new stream of refugee higher education. It essentially focuses on the case of Eritreans in Ethiopia. Next slide, please. As you might possibly know, Ethiopia is one of the largest refugee hosting countries. Currently, it hosts refugees from 26 different countries, but the largest, as you might see, are from South Sudan, Somalia, and Eritrea. Next slide. The Eritreans cover 22% of the refugees residing in Ethiopia, going directly to the common schemes in which refugees access higher education. We have three major schemes. One is what we call international scholarship programs. These are essentially done with the UNHCR. And the most popular is what we know as Albert Einstein German Academic Refugee Initiative Fund, known popularly as DIFFERE. This is very popular in almost 41 countries. Sub-Saharan Africa is the biggest recipient, and Ethiopia happens to be one of the beneficiaries. 28 public higher education institutions involved in this scholarship, and most of these payments are made to the Ethiopian public universities through UNHCR. The second one is host country scholarships. This is an initiative of the Ethiopian government, essentially covered by the Ethiopian government itself. 75% of the payments, the subsidies given to the public universities, only 25% is covered by the UNHCR. We have the third scheme, next slide, which I called self-financing scheme, whereby refugees themselves, through the cooperation that they receive from fellow refugees, migrants, and relatives, fund their own education. This has been made actually possible as a result of what is here called out-of-the-camp scheme. Refugees since 2010 were allowed in Ethiopia to go out of the camp and live in cities, provided that they prove they have the capacity to sustain their lives. And we have around 33,000 of refugees living in different cities, and mainly in Addis, and 80 to 85% of these happen to be Eritreans. And these people happen to live in Addis. But one of the things that's happening within the refugee community is most of these people, especially when they have the required assistance, have chosen to pay for their education, go to private colleges. And I think this study focused on these specific refugee students who are paying for their own education. Next slide. And this study was essentially a qualitative study, and we wanted to know the purposes and patterns of self-financed higher education, the major challenges that these students are facing, and the policies and support schemes, both at national and institutional level. Next slide. So the methodology we used was qualitative research design. We chose 40 students who were involved in focus group discussion and interviews, and 2 people from government agency, which we call ARA, who were also interviewed to understand the whole pattern and the purposes of the self-financed refugee higher education. Now, one of the things that we understood is that this is a well-planned and future-oriented type of higher education, where refugees themselves planning together with the assistance that they are receiving are planning for their future in terms of facilitating their onward movement or in terms of facilitating their well-being. So they anticipate that the kind of training that they are receiving in Ethiopia would somehow benefit them at the end of the day when they go and settle in affluent nations. Even the choice of the subjects that they have, where we see that medical programs are chosen over social sciences, indicates that they anticipate that these would be much preferred in the countries where they are planning to settle. We think that there is no specific information about whether these expectations and anticipations are met, whether their skill training is recognized where they settle, but this is a conscious move in which refugees help each other to prepare themselves for whatever is to come in their future. Next thing we find out, next slide, is that quite concurrent with other studies at global level, we've also found that there are many challenges that the students are facing. This relates to their background, the way they have been experiencing things from the very time that they decided to move to other countries, and this relates to the emotional and psychological challenges they have, especially the traumatic experiences they have had while traveling to the countries where they are residing, the psychological stress while still they are attending their education, and the feeling that they are not certain about their future. All these combine to bring in a kind of psychological stress, emotional stress on the students. These somehow affect the way they are performing and staying within Ethiopia as well. The other thing that we noted was that the kind of help that was expected in the form of psychiatric treatment is absent while they arrive in Ethiopia, and that has had its own impact. Next slide. The socio-cultural challenges are much better as compared to the other types of challenges. There is a big Eritrean community within Addis. There are areas where they live and do business. So outside class, they had very limited challenges, but within classrooms, they feel that their use of Amharic sometimes is misunderstood, and they are taken for being rude, domineering, and impolite sometimes because of the misunderstandings that happen with the Ethiopian students. Next, and we also have had the chance to identify, next slide, what we call academic challenges and linguistic challenges. The academic challenges are reflected in the form of disrupted schooling. They stay for some years in the refugee camps before they come to the cities and attend the classes. They feel that all these have some impact on the way they are performing in class. Academic skills, different school ethos have been major challenges that they feel are hindering their progress. Actually, most of them stated that they require a semester or two before they try to catch up with the Ethiopian students. Linguistic challenges have been on 2 fronts. There is this working language Amharic, which is used in classroom and outside most often. Teachers even use it in classroom, while English is supposed to be the medium of instruction. So students find this very challenging in terms of facilitating their academic progress, in terms of mingling with Ethiopian students. But when there are some refugee students who are better in terms of speaking Amharic, they provide some assistance, but they still claim that there is a lot of challenge in terms of all these. Next, please. The next thing we looked at was the policy environment and support schemes. The national policy and government support are quite impressive, I would say. The Ethiopian higher education law in 2004 was, in a way, had certain restrictions, but the 2019 higher education law permits refugees to move around and be treated like nationals. So because of these laws and because of the certain conventions, pledges, and commitments that the Ethiopian government is making, I think at least refugee students are supposed to have access to higher education in the form of scholarships or the self-financed schemes that I was talking about. There is also this, what we call the Administration for Refugees and Returnee Affairs, which is responsible as a government body to coordinate with UNHCR, to coordinate with the students outside of the academic sphere, and even after they start their classes, to give all the kinds of support that they need. But unfortunately, the institutional support is literally non-existent, we would say. Most of the institutions are not aware of even the existence of these students. They don't have policies and preparations to accommodate their distinct needs. The lack of tutorials, guidance, counseling services, all these are putting a lot of pressure on the students in terms of facilitating their studies. Sometimes even teachers do not identify the Eritrean students from the Ethiopian students because we look alike, and it's very, very difficult to provide that kind of service. The institutions are also limited in terms of resources, private institutions, so they don't really take the courage to look into such differences, types of students that they have, and provide the necessary support. Next slide. I think by way of conclusion, we can see that in line with the global challenges of refugee higher education students, we see that whether paying or not, refugee students face a lot of academic, linguistic, emotional, and socio-cultural challenges. Though the fact that this self-financing scheme and out-of-camp living scheme has allowed these students to open up opportunities, the kinds of challenges that they have imply some pedagogic issues. So it's not only enough to provide access, as was said earlier on by other presenters, but the need for academic and non-academic support is always there. And it appears that this is very, very important. And there are certain specific areas like psychiatric treatments, guidance, support, tutorial classes, and awareness of the challenges of these students that happen to be needed in terms of enhancing refugee higher education in the Ethiopian context. Now, another thing we see is, though the government policies appear to be positive and promote refugee interests, the institutional practice do not happen to be in line with these government policies. There is a lot of work to be done in that area as well. Despite all these national policies, government support, and deficiencies at the institutional level, you would also see that what we have found out to be very strong in terms of the outcome of this research is that there is this resolve and cooperative efforts of refugees to take care of the issue, their future, and do whatever is possible in terms of attending higher education, which I think is very, very important and critical to their future. Again, in terms of what Hans was earlier saying, who is shouldering the responsibility of refugees, Ethiopia's commitment to refugees is also one thing that we see as an encouraging move, despite the fact that this country has also a lot of problems, internal displacements, meager resources, and deficient systems of support. All this suggests that yes, there are different schemes of support to refugee higher education, but schemes like self-financed higher education, which has not been studied enough, both at global and continental level, need further research and further study. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wondwosen. Giving this perspective, I think quite similar to also what is happening in, for instance, Lebanon and Turkey, as our research has been showing, that maybe even there higher education is doing much more under much more difficult circumstances that we do for displaced persons in European or the North American context. I hand over to Simon for the Q&A. Simon.
Yeah, thanks, Hans. And thanks, Wondwosen, for such a good presentation. Great that you didn't have any connection issues. Good that Andrew was able to finish. That was an important point about the problem of judging graduates, refugee graduates in terms of employability, and also the cost of that for higher education institutions as well. Lisa, the landscaping, I hope it isn't happening at the Golden Gate Bridge, which is your background. I thought maybe the Trump government was on the way out, was going to detonate the Golden Gate Bridge as a sort of payback to California. Quite worrying. Let's go straight to the Q&A then. Rosanna Gillespie has the first question. Rosanna.
Oh, hi. Thanks very much for this session. It's really interesting. I was just thinking, so I work at Imperial College London, and thinking about ways that we might want to engage with refugees who aren't able to come to the UK, considering most people stay in countries near to their home countries. Is there any way we could use the online learning, especially now that we're all getting a lot more comfortable with online learning, to engage with those groups?
Who would like to pick that up?
I can start briefly, and of course it's a very important point, and there are several initiatives that we have seen. Maybe Lisa can say something about a German project in that context, but also, for instance, I know a consortium of Jesuit universities in the United States is working on delivering online education in refugee camps, for instance, in Nigeria and other parts of Africa, which is possible, but at the same time having a lot of challenges because of poor internet connections. We're talking about Andrew's connection, but of course in refugee camps that's even more of a challenge. Having facilities like laptops, etc., is a challenge. The people have to survive for food, etc., makes it very difficult for them to concentrate. But at the same time, by lack of other options, it's necessary. That's the context of what also Wondwosen described of Eritreans who are not in refugee camps but are displaced in the big cities. We see that also in Turkey, for instance. They have more opportunities to get access to higher education and online higher education than in the camps itself. So we also have to look in that context. But certainly much more should be done in this area than we are doing at the moment. We still have this perception displacement means that we have a problem with refugees in Europe and North America, but as I said before, most of the refugees are not there, and they need to have much more access because that makes their future much more likely to be successful. But maybe one of the other presenters briefly want to say something.
Anyone else?
I can jump in just briefly. I did just respond in part to Diana's excellent question, and I'll extend what Hans said to note that, of course, as he mentioned, there are a number of different stakeholders offering online higher education initiatives. Some of them end with a certificate of completion. Some of them end with full degrees, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. What is the outcome for the student, and what are students actually wanting and needing in the context in which they're located and which they hope to be. And it's also important to keep in mind that most of these initiatives at the moment are, as Hans said, very small scale. Chiron University, which has received enormous funding from foundations including Google and Volkswagen, has had very small graduation rates from its bachelor's program. So we have to think about, in some ways, you know, what sorts of open assessment are going on in the realm of online higher education? How can information be made transparent? What is the duty of online providers to do so? Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Diana Laurelard.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for your excellent presentation. I think my question, as you've already answered it, does follow on from the discussion that you were just having, both with that question, Rosanna's question, and what Hans said in reply to it. Because what I've been wondering is whether this area of research, which is kind of based within Europe and the refugee situation within Europe, how we can use the insights from this to understand what's happening for the refugee students that we're working with in the camps in Lebanon, for example. And one of the NGOs, Mosaic Education, is trying to provide support for those students who want to get access to higher education. So they're working with them kind of on the ground. And that's quite helpful because then you have a much more kind of co-developed program for the refugees because it's starting in the right place. But there is, as you say, Lisa, there's so little research on that kind of end of it and what's happening in the camps and so on. But I'd be delighted to be able to use what you've been doing and get insights from that. Do you think that the work that you've all been doing can tell us something about what refugees need who are still in those camps in Turkey, Lebanon, wherever they are?
I could just very briefly say, I think that the work of Thomas Cray, C-R-E-A, and Sarah Dryden-Peterson, that might be particularly helpful. Those are folks who've looked at refugee education in the camps. And yes, absolutely, Diana, I think there is a crossover between the work that's being done on brick and mortar institutions providing higher education and these various online initiatives, which again span so many different types and have such different outcomes at the moment. Yeah, just an enormous need for additional research and collaboration.
Yes, just in response to what you were saying there. The wholly online solution is really difficult because for all the reasons that you're all saying, is that students in this kind of position have multiple needs of support, really. And so the more that, if we can offer online education, obviously that's a great help, but it needs to be embedded in local support as well. So we need to have partnerships with universities in Jordan and various other places. Which would make it much more likely then that those students who do make it into education do actually succeed and attain what they hope for.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, we seem still to do it in the classical way as the West giving help, but we don't collaborate with local partners. And as you have seen in the case of what Wondwosen was presenting, those universities do already a lot and have much more experience and much more context to be successful. So that's a very good point to make. Yeah.
Next question
I
is
think
from.
If I may say,
Wondwosen, I'm sorry. As you come in, you've not had the chance to say anything in this Q&A.
Shall I?
Yes, please.
Yes, online education provides a lot of potential, but at the same time, as Hans was saying, it's also good to see how such systems of support and such alternatives work both in the developing and the developed world as well. If you look at the developing world, for instance, online education, despite its potential, has lots of problems, except in big cities. Even with big cities, we have a lot of experience in the last 8 months where even universities have not been able to provide the face-to-face education in a blended form, supported by online education. So what happens in the, what's the need in the developing world where there is a lot of, the 85% of the refugees are available is a serious question to be considered. And in that sense, it's always good to see what local universities are doing and how they can be supported in that sense.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Wondwosen.
And thank you, Diana, for starting that conversation. Solomon Zawalde. Hello, Solomon. Come in. Good to see you. Solomon. This also does happen.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah. Just two quick points. As I wrote there on the chat, I haven't read the book in the first place. Okay. Excuse me if I'm making any observations that are not really warranted. And that's already in the book. Well, I was thinking, as both Lisa and Andrew has indicated, probably Hans too, both experience and outcomes are highly racialized phenomenon, highly racialized processes as far as refugee students, especially in Western universities, is concerned. So I wonder if you have made that observation, and I strongly feel that there is a need to use a theoretical framework, a conceptual framework that would help us to foreground race and ethnicity and see how that kind of shapes their educational experience while at university. I don't know how much you have done that, but that is very, very important. Refugees are very, very different kinds of people, and both outcomes and experience are highly racialized for them. That's all, the majority of the research shows that. My second observation and I need your opinion on that. Mostly in research activities, universities in the West seem to pathologize refugees. I would like to borrow Professor Anne Phoenix's couplet concepts of normalized presence and pathologized presence and normalized absence. So what happens usually is in research activities, in scholarly activities, refugee students are always represented as the other, you know, as the anomaly, as a typical student. That's what predominantly research, that's how predominantly research represents refugees. But their absence, their quietness, their silence in the higher education community is seen as normal, accepted as normal. Okay, and that extends to their siblings too. Okay, that extends even to their children in educational outreach. I don't know how much you have considered this, but this is out there in the large, you know, in the educational literature, both in research and scholarly work.
Who would like to pick it up?
Well, maybe I can start, and if somebody else wants to follow up. But I think the 2 points you made are in itself very relevant and but also very sensitive. I mean, if you look at, for instance, what happened with the big refugee crisis in Europe, there was a big, or originally, later it disappeared a little bit because they were too optimistic, but there was a big difference between the perception of Syrian refugees and refugees from Northern Africa, and partly that was based on racist perceptions. It was based also on the educational background. The expectation was that's why we schaffen das from Angela Merkel was, oh, the Syrians are educated enough, are more similar and easily adaptable to our society, so they can take the places that we need in our healthcare system, etc., which was completely different than the perception of the North Africans without having education, Eritreans, for instance, and Somalians. So that issue is a sensitive issue, but certainly is an issue that needs more attention, and that reflects also in your second point of the how we treat both in our research, but also in the perceptions, refugees as the other ones that and uneducated ones and difficult ones and problematic ones, instead of seeing them as an opportunity, which was partly the case in the Wir schaffen das period, but later disappeared. So I think you make two in itself important points, but would be interested to hear also what Wondwosen or Andrew or Lisa would say about that.
Mm-hmm. Colleague?
Could I perhaps pick that up? Somali Australians here, just to go back to that example, suffer the discrimination both of being dark-skinned and Muslim often. So that's sort of the two worst things you can be in Australia. So there's a sort of double-barrel discrimination against groups such as that. But the broader point about, I think, critical race theory in particular, which can play a role here. We've looked a lot at Tara Yosso's work in the US around different forms of cultural capital and whose cultural capital matters, and really trying to introduce those concepts into the curriculum in particular. So it's a question about admissions as well, but it's also a question about campus climate and about how universities and employers treat different groups, but really trying to get at that, unpicking what we consider to be normal and what we consider to be strengths, and trying to delve into linguistic capital and familial capital and resistant capital, and understand the contributions that students make to their communities and to their families, and really try to interrogate the norms in higher education. So I think the point is right, that it needs a bit of theoretical depth, and it needs some curricular work and also some pedagogical work within the university to try to address some of those unconscious biases and some of those perceptions that are that do require that theoretical work, and that all just exacerbates the broader discrimination, as I say, that groups such as African Australians, which is a very new migrant group in Australia, suffer.
We're running out of time, folks. Solomon, that was a very interesting strand of you introduced into the discussion, and we need more time to talk about it. If you want to lead a webinar in our program, on Tuesday or Thursday at any stage in January, February, we'd really welcome that. So write to me and by email, and we can set that up. I think I'll have to say to Claire Callender and Fateh Shaban that we won't have time, I'm very sorry to say, for your contribution and your questions. But I might invite Hans and the panel to say any last words before we close.
Thank you. Let me give the panel first the possibility. If maybe we start with Wondwosen, last remarks.
I think Salomon's observation says a lot in terms of what we have discussed and in terms of what we have to do. Perceptual differences will always be there, but the question is, how much are we aware of it? How much are we sensitive about it? And how much are we ready to attend to it? I think that brings all the discussions and the suggestions together. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, Lisa.
Thanks, Hans, and again to Simon. I'll just pick up briefly on Caroline's comment. Yes, Caroline, I completely agree. I think there is a real need for cross-disciplinary research. I'd love to continue the conversation with you and anyone on this call about future directions. Thanks so much for your time.
Yeah. Andrew?
Well, yeah, just to say again, thank you for the seminar. We've covered a lot of ground here. And just happy to refer people again to some of the reports and papers we've written at La Trobe at cheetah.com. But I think it's been a really interesting discussion, and it is genuinely a global discussion. So thanks, Simon and Hans, for the time today.
Yeah, my last remark basically is, I think what has shown this webinar is there's even more research needed than we have been already doing. And indeed, interdisciplinary research about what Betty Lisk and Hagan Ergen and I called forced internationalization. So internationalization is that people move on a voluntary way, but displaced persons are forced to go somewhere else to study and then have all the problems how to get access to it and then how to get through it. So, and in that, I think indeed it is very important that we should not see it as a kind of problem for the developed world, but as an issue that's a global issue and that we have to address in a global context. So thank you.
Look, I wanted to thank the panel and Hans especially for that great webinar. We needed more time. I think Hans, you're absolutely right about the importance of the issue growing in future. I mean, we will have more displaced population, more displaced people, more educational responsibilities in relation to those people. And all of the issues that we're concerned about in relation to global relationships, all the inequalities, all the unevenness, all the colonial past and post-colonial issues, all those issues come very sharply into focus here. But at the heart of it, it's about raw human need that we have to meet. We really have to. Thanks, folks. And can I invite you all to tune in again next Tuesday, where we have Global Practices in the Global Learning Environment, another book symposium, this time led by Hanna Tange from Denmark. So look forward to seeing everyone then. Thanks again, Hans and the panel. Bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.